Like, okay, I'll stand here. I guess this micro or the thing is right here. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our talk that we are having today. We are so excited to have this hybrid event, and I am excited to see faculty and wonderful students here today. And we are hosting today Dr. Sarah Perry Myers, who is an associate professor of history at Messiah University in Central Pennsylvania, where she teaches courses on 20th century U.S. history, gender, public history, and military history. She is the recipient of a 2020-2022 National Endowment for the Humanities NEH Dialogues on the Experience of War grant for a program focusing on generating dialogue with female veterans. For this grant, she led discussion workshops with veterans in Military Women's Memorial at Arlington National Cemetery. Her book, Earning Their Wings, The Wasps of World War II and Their Fight for Veteran Recognition, UNC Press, explores the history of women Air Force service pilots. She has 2 chapters on the history of military pilots and gender during World War II and edited collections by Palgrave Macmillan and Rutledge. And she is currently co-editing an anthology exploring the human cost of flight, a history of aviation, trauma, gender, and emotions with historians Jason Krothamal and Jordan Pitt. And her interviews have appeared on C-SPAN 3 and PBS. She also served on the advisory board and interviewed in a documentary aired on PBS entitled Charlotte Mansfield, a woman photographer goes to war. And Mansfield was in the Women's Army Corps during World War II. She has presented at conferences, including the National Council on Public History, the Society for Military History, which I guess you're not at today because it started today, right? Not there this year. Okay. I was going to say, I just saw that it was starting today and people are getting excited. And the American Historical Association, Smithsonian American's Women's History Initiative, and the British Commission for Military History's New Research in Military History Conference and Waging Peace Conference, sponsored by the Dale Center for the Study of War and Society at the University of Southern Mississippi. She's also given talks at Historic Fort Snelling in Minnesota, the Intrepid Sea, Air and Space Museum in New York City, and the Betty H. Carter Women's Veterans Historical Project at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. And prior to her position at Messiah University, she was director for the Kieran Family World War II Museum in Loretto, Pennsylvania, where she curated museum exhibits and an oral history project. Welcome, Dr. Myers. We are so excited to have you.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. And thank you, everyone, for taking the time to listen to this talk today. I know how busy everyone is, and I appreciate you working it in and being excited about Texas history. So I'm going to share my screen because I have a PowerPoint with images that I want to show you, some photographs from the war. All right. So I think, Chloe, at any point, you can just let me know if you can't see something. All right, so we're going to talk about the ways that women were trained during the war, and then I will stop at a certain point to give you all time if you have questions. So if you want to kind of make note of what you want to ask as we go along here. So basically, my book is about women's training and experiences as pilots in the years prior to World War II, then their training during the war, and then their assignments. And then I also look at them in the decades after the war when these women try to fight for military status. So basically, I'm going to walk us through kind of the history of this program in that context, focusing on training in Texas and their assignments. So these women are interested in flight because they love aviation, they love the skies. And so I love this quote from one of the pilots. Her name was Cornelia Fort. And she said, "I was happiest in the sky at dawn when the quietness of the air was like a caress, when the noon sun beat down, and at dusk when the sky was drenched with the fading light." So Cornelia Fort in this letter home to her mother is really talking about, you know, painting a picture for us of what she felt like it was like to fly. And the women and men who are serving in World War II are all making similar descriptions about the beauty of flight, the beauty of aircraft, their interest in flying for a career, like for professions. And a lot of these people were inspired by barnstormers during the early decades of the 20th century. Barnstormers were these pilots who would fly into rural areas, typically on farms, which is where you get the name Barnstormer. And they would fly demonstrations for people who had never seen airplanes before. So they'd heard about them, but had never seen one. And so they would land in fields, on farms, and then they would also take people up for rides. You had to pay like a fee, of course. And then people got experience with flight this way. And so a lot of the pilots who serve in World War II actually say that they were first inspired because they saw a barnstormer, they heard about it, or they heard about famous barnstormers like Amelia Earhart or Charles Lindbergh, who were known for being the first two individuals to fly nonstop across the Atlantic. So you get, kind of these inspirations from different places. Cornelia Fort was one of these people. She grew up in Tennessee. She was a barnstormer. She was interested in flight from an early age. And in particular, her story connects with World War I because on December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, Cornelia Fort was actually at Pearl Harbor training a student. And not only was she there, but she was in the sky with one of her male pilots and students. And so as they were flying in the sky, she quickly realized what was happening, right? With Japanese airplanes flying all around them. And so she took over the controls from the male student, landed safely at Pearl Harbor, and then she and the male student were both safe. And then they both eventually made their way back to the mainland United States. But she has this scary early story experience, literally the moment when we're going to join the war. And so I'm going to kind of pick her story up here later as I talk more about different aspects of this training program that was in Texas. But she's a great introduction to kind of explain why people were interested in flying, how they got excited about flying, and honestly really just nerded out over aircraft and aviation. All right, so speaking of some famous pilots, these are two pilots that I think should be household names on the equivalent of Amelia Earhart. This is Jackie Cochran on the left, Nancy Love on the right. These are women who had tremendously successful aviation careers in the first half of the 20th century. They both set they both set aviation records. There were all sorts of air shows and competitions that they were a part of. Both women had very established themselves as successful pilots with thousands of flying hours in the years prior to World War II. So as the war is starting in Europe, 1939, these women are both interested in the ways that women would potentially be able to serve in the US military as pilots. They're interested because prior to World War II, women actually don't serve as pilots in the military. The women I'm showing you here on the screen, these are actually the first official women who were in the military for the US. There had been other women who served in various capacities. You might know about them in the Civil War when they cross-dressed as men to pretend, to have male identities to fight in combat. But then in later years, they serve as nurses for the military, but as civilian workers. And so World War I is the first moment where you have this group of women in the Signal Corps who are controlling switchboard operations and communications in France during the war that are going to eventually get military status. And I'll actually talk a little bit more about them later because they get military status at the same time that these women pilots in World War II get military status. So because women hadn't yet served in the military in this capacity, Jackie Cochran and Nancy Love approach the military, and they both have contacts with officials. Jackie Cochran in particular is friends with General Henry Hap Arnold. He is going to be the future commanding general of the Army Air Force and of the Air Force later after the war. And so she talks to him about, is this a possibility? Nancy Love is friends with some of the military officials who are in the ferrying division in the military. And so they talk about, could women ferry planes, for example, if we go to war and that kind of thing. At first, both of these women's, ideas they were just kind of acknowledged, but not taken very seriously. What happens is in 1942, when we have heavy casualties in Europe with regards to pilots and bombing crews specifically, this is when the Army Air Force, as it was known at the time, decides like maybe we should consider bringing in women, but only on the home front to fly military planes. And so both of these women are actually given directorship of pilot programs specifically for women. Jackie Cochran is in charge of a program that is going to train women in military flight. And it's going to take women who have a decent number of flying hours, but not thousands of flying hours. So instead, they just have hundreds of flying hours. Nancy Love is actually going to take a small group of pilots who have thousands of flying hours, and she's going to organize a program for them within the ferrying division, where they're going to take planes from military bases, fly them, to the coasts, also flying planes from factories to bases so that then they can be taken overseas or to a different base. And so these two women's programs in 1943 are going to merge together to form what we know as the Women Air Force Service Pilot Program with the acronym WASP. It's the acronym of the insect, right? But when I went through military records, I could never find evidence that they named or thought of the name of this program with the insect in mind, because the insect also flies, but it just is some kind of coincidence potentially or unwritten association. And so this WASP program that merges in 1943, and this is going to mean that the women are all under the umbrella and directorship of Jackie Cochran. So Nancy Love will report to Cochran. I'm using the word director instead of military rank because during the war, the women's pilot program, the WASP, was not considered military. What happens is Congress actually makes the decision to pass a bill to grant different women's units military status. And so during the war, there are all of these different women's units that form. So you see the WACs, which is the Women's Army Corps, the WAVES, the women in the Navy. That one was intentional. You see the pun association here. The SPARs and the Coast Guard after their motto. The Women Marines don't have an acronym because General Thomas Holcomb of the Marines says that they're Marines. They don't, quote, need a nickname. And so he's trying to establish this like Marine culture and this cultural image of the Marines as, going in first or fighting in intense situations that maybe other branches of the service wouldn't perform. That's kind of the image that they're trying to project to the Marines. And so he wants that to extend to the women as well, even though they're not fighting in combat. And so he just calls them Women Marines, and that name is going to stick for after the war. Then there's women who are serving still in the Navy and the Army as nurses, but all of these women who are listed here are all going to have bills go before Congress. And so Congress is going to decide to grant the WACs military status, the WAVES, etc. The WASP are going to be the last bill to go before Congress. And so I'll talk to you later about what that looks like for them and their experience with that. But for now, just note that these women are, going to have no rank and be considered, directors, etc., until Congress passes a bill, and then that's when they receive their military rank. Each one of these is a new experiment as it's described. So the military, no matter the branch of service, calls this incorporation of women into these new roles as quote unquote experimental. And essentially what they're doing is they're trying to figure out what roles they can expand and include for women. This is very similar to factory work. When people think of World War II, they think of Rosie the Riveter and the new roles that women are holding during the war and the different new types of work that they're going to perform. So the same is true for women who are in the military. So you can see in all these different branches and services and units, the ways that they're thinking about it as experimental and then deciding, to submit bills to Congress to make things more permanent, to make them military. All right, so training. So the WASP train in Houston, the first couple of classes of WASP train in Houston, and then all of the rest of the classes of the WASP train in Sweetwater. So they are, the training decision is moved to Sweetwater because there are, the base is a great location, minus, I don't even know how many of you have been to West Texas. It's where I went to grad school at Texas Tech. And so I got to experience the lovely dust storms of West Texas. And the women who are training here in West Texas are going to, talk about these dust storms and the sand in their teeth and the whole experience, which since I teach in Pennsylvania, I have to explain to students what these dust storms are like and show them images from YouTube and videos and things of the kind of levels of dust storms. But the idea was that since Sweetwater was already a training base, that they would convert it to a base that was just for women. So things at Houston had felt a little complicated because essentially most pilot training during the war, it consisted of three parts. There was primary, then there was basic, and then there was advanced training. So you basically move to different forms of aircraft as you move from primary to advanced. And so in this training, you see, in military training for men, you see them training at different bases for primary, different base for basic, and then a different one for advanced. They decided that since this program is experimental, that it will make things easier if they have all three levels of training just for these WASP at one field. And so things get complicated with who else is like training at Houston. And so they decide to move training to Sweetwater. And they also think that even though there are dust storms in West Texas, that the weather is fairly moderate and would be a great space for training year round. And so they convert Avenger Field at Sweetwater to training just for these WASP specifically. And then once the WASP are deemed like successful, they're going to just keep training there at the base. So this is a picture of them from Life magazine. They were actually featured on the cover of this issue in 1943. This is them taking ground school classes. So they're going to go through the same training as men minus combat. The idea is that you want to get pilots the most extensive experience possible. And so they're going to learn basics of physics and navigation. They're going to learn how to take apart aircraft engines. And so these are kind of classes that they experience in ground school classes. And then they also have flight school, which is where they practice flying those different types of aircraft. They practice cross-country flights, which is where you're given an assignment from one base to another, and then you have to get back. They practice night flying, trying to give the women as many experiences as possible in these aircraft. And also because this is a really intense training, you're trying to weed out people who are not skilled or qualified enough to fly military aircraft. This is, U.S. taxpayer dollars, and so they're very cognizant of taking as good a care of planes as possible, and so this is where that comes in. This is a newspaper image from the WASP who are graduating at Ellington Field. So this is the first class. As a frame of reference, there are 25,000 applicants to the WASP program during the war from 1942 to 1944. There are 1,830 who are accepted to the program, and then 1,074 are going to graduate from the program. That rate between the accepted, those who are entering training, and the graduation rates is actually the exact same as male pilots who were training during the war. So when you're thinking about this as experimental, they're deemed a success because they have the same rates and graduation test records and things like that. So training at West Texas in Sweetwater is, featured in this image, as you can tell from the wind blowing the women, their hair. I use this image to represent the fact that this is an all-female training base. It's only women who are training here, but a lot of their instructors are men. So there are also male pilots who are assigned to this base as instructors, and then there's also female pilots as well. Some of their instructors are civilian, some of their instructors are military. It just depended on what the U.S. Army Air Force could get during the war. And so sometimes they hired people as instructors who were highly qualified but were civilian, and then sometimes they assigned people who were in the military. During the war, when the women are first moved to Sweetwater, these early months of training, the uh, Army Air Force experiences something that they've never experienced before, which is there are a lot of male pilots who need to make emergency landings at Sweetwater. So at first, this is seen as like confusing, and then quickly everyone realizes what's going on. Essentially, the male pilots discover that there's a base of all female pilots who are training in military training, and so all of a sudden they have an emergency with their aircraft and they really need to land at Sweetwater specifically. And so the Army Air Force and Jackie Cochran decide, nope, we're not going to do this anymore. And so they shut down the field for emergency landings, outside of the WASP themselves. And so people, the WASP call this Cochran's Convent, implying that, it's an all-female training base. Jackie Cochran's in charge, but then also the fact that men are not allowed to land at the fields. Jackie Cochran is also very aware that, because this program is experimental, and she, as a highly skilled pilot, really is invested in seeing it, come through as a success. And so she wants these WASP to be isolated from male pilots because she doesn't want any rumors spreading about them. There have been, at this point in the war, media campaigns against the women who are in the Army Corps, Navy, etc. And there's all sorts of rumors flying around about what women are actually doing for these different services. And so Cochrane decides, like, we're going to shut down any rumors that anyone has about what these women are doing because I want them to be seen as professionals and as pilots. And so this is what she specifically focuses on. The program is organized as military because the idea is that eventually, if they're successful, they're going to request Congress grant them military status. And so on the right, you see a graduation ceremony from Sweetwater, Texas, when the WASP have their official uniforms that have been designed for them. On the left, you see one of the women pilots who I interviewed for this book. Her name was Marty Weil. She lived in Indiana, and she kindly allowed me to interview her. Her story is fun because I actually met her grandson on a plane when I was first starting this project, and I was trying to figure out, how do you locate women to interview? And I just happened to be sitting by her grandson on the flight. We didn't talk, and then at the very end of the flight, as we're getting off the plane, we started making small talk, and this is how I learned that his grandma is a WASP. And so he gave me her contact info, and Marty was the first WASP that I was able to interview. And so she very proudly asked me if I wanted to see her uniform, and she said it, no longer fit, but she wanted to show me. And so that's why I asked if I could use a picture of her, and this is her. So these uniforms are, military issued. They follow military regulations for wearing them. They swear an oath of allegiance entering the military to the Constitution. They also are going through the same military training minus combat. They're issued dog tags. Everything's very military focused. After training, they're going to serve across the United States at over 150 bases. So they're going to serve in the continental United States. This is a group of women who are, posing for a publicity photo in front of a B-24. These women are going to ferry planes, like I'd mentioned previously, where they take them from factories to bases or from bases internally in the US to the coast. And then they're also going to perform a range of other assignments during the war. One of the most dangerous assignments that they fly, it was called target towing. So on the left, you see an image of one of the WASP flying a target that is hooked to the back of her plane. The reason why you see the image from this perspective is because there's a journalist in this other aircraft who's taking this picture. And then from this same newspaper article on the right, you see the anti-aircraft artillery that is being shot at these targets. So the idea is when you target tow, you fly the same pattern repeatedly in the air so that whenever the servicemen on the ground are shooting their anti-aircraft artillery at your target, they can calculate precisely where it should land. This is a job that's performed by numerous pilots in the U.S. Army Air Force during the war. It's one that the WASP are then introduced to when, their program is like viewed as successful in 1943. And so the women are flying this same assignment alongside of male pilots who had already been doing it. What's crazy about it is that, live ammunition is being shot at the planes, but the women themselves, none of them are going to die from any live ammunition. There are going to be tragically some WASP who die in target towing assignments because of the nature of the planes that they're flying. So during the war, the Army Air Force is not using planes that are of the highest quality, right? Because you need those for overseas combat missions. And so the planes are very, in need of repair. And the mechanics on base, where women and men tow targets, talk about how they are trying to keep up with all the repairs that need to be done. And so tragically, there are men and women who die towing targets in the US as a result. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about, what that means for the WASP specifically. So as I mentioned at the beginning with Cornelia Fort and her excitement for flight and her excitement for different types of aircraft, this is an example of the kind of language that these WASP use about the aircraft that they fly during the war. So this is WASP Vi Cowden, who said, "The P-51 was the love of my life. It was so well engineered that once you were flying, once you had it trimmed, if you leaned forward, it would go forward. If you leaned back, it would go up. You could just," and then she explained how you didn't even have to touch it, right? And so she and other WASP are going to actually say, a lot of WASP are going to say that the P-51 is their favorite aircraft. This is a pursuit type of aircraft that flies very quickly and is very agile. And so a lot of the men and women who served during World War II talk about the difference between flying civilian aircraft versus military aircraft. During World War II, we're going to have a lot of technologies that develop within the aviation world. And so what you're going to see happen is, new types of planes that are developed, new technologies, new abilities of aircraft. And for the men and women who are serving during the war, this is incredibly exciting because you're getting to participate at like the forefront of these new technologies, but also it's exciting because you are flying either faster planes than civilian aircraft will go, or you're flying aircraft that are heavier and require more strength to fly. And they find that to be like very fun and exhilarating. And so a lot of pilots talk about what it's like flying at really high altitudes that you can't even reach with civilian aircraft that they have access to. And so I wanted to use an example of the ways in the language that they talk about this because they're just like incredibly excited by aviation and flight and high altitudes. Okay, so I said that I would explain what happens to these, women who die during their WASP service. So on the left, you see an excerpt from a WASP newsletter. So just like male servicemen, just like women who are serving, around the U.S. and overseas. They're going to develop their own newsletter that is for them. It's similar to Stars and Stripes of today, where it's going to be like for service members, and it's kind of just a way to culturally talk about things, to joke about the experience of being in the military. In this instance, you see the WASP including memorials to their, fellow service women. And so you see on the left, Jane Champlin was a WASP trainee who died in an accident with her instructor, who you see on the right. She and her instructor die in this accident at Avenger Field in Sweetwater. When there's a field report of this later, it's determined that it was not their fault. It was something with the aircraft that was unavoidable. And so while neither pilot was to blame, it's a very tragic consequence of flying military aircraft during World War II, and honestly flying military aircraft at any point in US history. And so the women hold, memorials in their newsletters. And then decades later, after the war, when they meet for yearly reunions at Sweetwater, they held memorial services for the servicewomen who died during the war, specifically at the WASP. And so you see that here on the right. So during the course of the war, there were 38 women who lost their lives in service to their country. Because they were civilian, and because Congress had not yet passed a bill for them, what that meant is that even though they were organized as military, when they died, their families had to pay to ship their bodies home. The families also were responsible for the cost of their burials. They had to use civilian insurance for that. They also were not allowed to display, and were told not to display, although some people personally decided to violate this, but they were told not to display gold stars, because a gold star in your window meant the loss of a service member. The blue stars meant that you had someone serving. So they were told not to display gold stars, and they were also told that they couldn't have military funerals. Although again, I found instances where some of the women's families had the local community give them a military funeral. And so when you think about the long-term repercussions of this, for women who were injured during the war, I found instances where women had, strange things happen to them that wouldn't normally happen to a civilian. There was a woman flying a cargo plane in the US with men who'd returned from the China, Burma, India theater of war, and they had some kind of infection that they had gotten because they flew these men and were exposed to them on this cargo flight. And they had to report that to their insurance companies and then fight with their civilian insurance companies to try to get medical coverage and benefits from this. So they're in this very weird, in between space where they don't have the same sorts of benefits that you see for other service members. The other thing with the WASP is that they're not going to get military status until 1977. And so after the war, even though other women serving in units, men who served in the military have access to the GI Bill with reduced loan rates, access to college education, things like that, that doesn't apply to the WASP because they are considered civilian. So in December 20th, 1944, the WASP program is shut down by the Army Air Force. The reason why this happens is because they decide that, without congressional support, the program can't go on. And so in 1944, when the WASP bill, which is the last women's unit to go before Congress, Congress debates. And unlike for all of the other branches of the service, they decide that for the WASP, they are going to vote no to military status. This is a complicated decision that I talk extensively about in my book, but to give you kind of a bird's eye view, essentially Congress chooses to listen to voices who are not of top military officials. They're men who are serving as civilians on the home front during the war in some capacity. for civilian pilot training program that shuts down. Congress also talks about a Hollywood movie that comes out. There's this Hollywood movie called Ladies Courageous. And in this movie, which is completely fictitious, the basic plot in the movie is that there are some women pilots who aren't called the WASP, but who, as a viewer, if you had heard about the program at that point, you're going to associate with the WASP. And for congressional representatives, they associated with the WASP. So this women pilot in the military is ferrying planes across the US and flirting with men as she goes. And so what you see happen is her wreck, planes and just exhibit like very unprofessional behavior. There's like a love triangle at one point. And so it's just very like sensationalized, not about professionalism, not about training, not even mentions of like what they're doing for the war effort or anything like this. And so Congress actually talks about this movie in their debates to say like, oh, but these women aren't doing anything that's serious, etc. And so the WASP are devastated because they entered the military thinking that this is their chance for a career in aviation. At this point, commercial airlines are starting off, like you see commercial aviation prior to World War II, but they're not hiring female pilots. And so there's not an opportunity in commercial aviation for women. When you think about other jobs in the US, it's very limited with regards to aviation jobs. And so these women were really thinking that this was their chance to fly for careers. And so in this picture, you see the last WASP class who are trying to decide who gets to deliver the last round of pursuit aircraft, the P-47. And so it's just like a devastating moment for the women who think that they're going to get to be in these careers and then find it abruptly ended before the war has even ended in the US. So after the war ends, even though like the women talk about like, I really thought we were going to be, get a second chance, etc. When they don't, they meet for yearly reunions. So I have, some 4 years of random decades here portrayed for you. They are going to meet, have discussions about their wartime experiences as other veterans groups do, and reminisce about military flying and kind of catch up on each other's lives, all of this. At their reunions, they talk about the possibility of getting military status. They especially explain that they were really hoping that women who were in that group of 38, that those women would get military status. And so at a certain point in the 1960s, they decide to make a concentrated effort to try to see if they can get military status to honor the lives of those 38. So one of the like individuals who helps the WASP with their organization as they, meet with congressional representatives, have everyday Americans who are registered to vote sign petitions and that kind of thing. The people who are going to help them are Senator Barry Goldwater, who you see seated here, and then Colonel Bruce Arnold on the right. Both of these men have personal connections to the WASP. Barry Goldwater, Senator Barry Goldwater, was in the Army Air Force during World War II, and he served alongside the WASP in Delaware. And so he explains to his congressional contacts that, yes, these women should get military status. They did the same things as me. We need, to do this for them. On the right, Colonel Bruce Arnold was the son of General Henry Hap Arnold, who was the commanding general of the Army Air Force. And so he's like, my dad wanted this passed. Like, this is what my dad wanted. And so I want to see this through for you. So Colonel Arnold and Senator Goldwater are going to help the women with political connections. And then the women are going to do all the work of organizing. Like I said, petitions, meeting with reps. This is not the era where you can just like, post things on social media or text each other. So instead what you see happen is they're typing letters on typewriters and then mailing them out and asking each other like, hey, do you have Doris's mailing address, et cetera, and trying to get in contact with each other. All right, so Congress debates, I'll go back to the slide. So Congress is going to debate in 1970s the bills that are going to go before them. And what they decide is that they're going to grant the women military status. So in 1977, the bill officially passes and the WASP are granted this status. Which just means basically that they're now considered officially veterans. So that means they have access to benefits, reduced loan rates, education rates, like things like that. 38 WASP get, military recognition, but also means that for future WASP who die after 1977, they're going to get to be, interned at Arlington National Cemetery. They're going to get military funerals and things like that. And so the women are very excited by this success and what it means for them personally. So the women who were in the Signal Corps during World War I were actually also added to this bill because these women had also received military training, had served during the war in uniforms, etc. And so what's interesting about it is they officially become the first women in the US military retroactively. And then the WASP are also on this same bill. And so these different groups of women are going to be on the same bill granting military status. There are also going to be discussions of other military groups and like who gets military status. And so what's interesting about this moment is actually that there's a lot of debate in the 70s about who do we want to grant military status? Like, what does it mean to be a veteran in this country? There are going to be people who are against the WASP who are going to say things like, veteran is someone who serves in combat and makes that distinction, where then there are going to be other people who are like, well, no, the majority of people don't serve in combat, so it should incorporate anyone who served in the military. And then there are discussions about like, does that mean overseas? Does that mean here, etc. And so there's all these like debates surrounding it. And then, like I said, the ultimate conclusion is that for the WASP and for the women in the Signal Corps, that they're considered to be military status. All right, so decades after the war, in 1973, so 4 years prior to the WASP receiving military status, the next round, I should say, of US women are admitted to pilot training. So from 1944 to 1973, women don't have access to military aviation. So they don't have access to military flying. They also don't have access to commercial aviation because commercial airlines don't hire women until the 1970s. And so women don't have access to aviation as a career in these, main fields. There are ways that some women carved out jobs for themselves in aviation, but it's a small percentage because it's a very hard field to get into when you can't do commercial airlines and you can't do the military. So thinking about it from a career perspective. Then the WASP get veteran status in 1977. And then in 2010, they're awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, which you can see a picture here from that ceremony. One of the WASP, who is from Texas, is accepting this award on behalf of all the WASP. Okay, so this seems like an end to the story, but what I'm going to explain here in the next like couple minutes, and then I'll save time for questions, is there are further discussions about who is a veteran. So during the 1960s and 70s, they debate, who's a veteran? Should we give it to the WASP, etc. Then what you see happen actually, as recently as 2015, is the story around Elaine Danforth Harmon. So Elaine was one of the WASP during World War II. I actually interviewed her in 2011, 2012. And when I was interviewing her, I asked her all kinds of things about her service, times during the war, etc. And one of the things that she told me is that she was really excited to be interned at Arlington National Cemetery because her husband had served during World War II. She had family members who'd been in the military. And so it was important for her to be interned at a military cemetery, and in this instance, Arlington. So fast forward to 2015. So in 2015, in September, Elaine passes away, and her family puts in the request for Arlington National Cemetery for her internment. There were other WASP who had been interned prior to this, and so they assumed that, this would be a pretty straightforward process for them. When they hear back from the Army, they're told that their request is denied. And what they find out is that just a few months earlier, in March of 2015, the Army had actually issued a memo stating an official change to groups who were allowed to be interned at Arlington National Cemetery. The bottom line is that the decision was made to limit because they have limited space at Arlington, to limit spaces to people who'd performed certain kinds of service. And so the WASP, although there was not a justification given, the WASP were added to a list that were considered not the level of service that they were looking for Arlington. WASP were not informed of this, and so when the family found out in the fall of 2015, this was the first they'd heard about that memo that had been issued, and the first they learned of this news. So the family was, obviously devastated. And so they decide, what are our options? They ask around and find, well, you could, do a lawsuit. But if you do a lawsuit, even if you win, it only means that Elaine can be interned there. It doesn't mean future WASP can. And so what they ultimately decide to do is try to get a bill before Congress. They enlist the help of Representative Martha McSally, who had served in the Air Force, because they thought, who better to consider veteran status than a fellow female pilot who was in the military. And so they ask her, and long story short, bill goes before Congress. And in 2016, surprisingly, unanimously, Congress votes to grant the WASP again permission to be interned at Arlington National Cemetery. And so Elaine had her funeral a year later, in September 2016. And this is a picture of her daughter, Terry Harmon, receiving the flag at this funeral. And so what you see happen is like these, again, the WASP being debated and contested and their veteran status being questioned. And so this is kind of a conclusion to the way that you see like women in their like roles during war, but also thinking about people just in general who are military pilots and the ways that people often have to debate or prove their military status. So one of the groups I didn't mention is the Merchant Marines, which were male service members who also are going to face these exact same things that the WASP do with regards to veteran status and having to prove their worth for including veteran status and including internment at Arlington National Cemetery. So with that, I would love to open it up for questions, kind of trying to be respectful of everyone's time here. So please let me know if you have anything you'd like to ask.
Thank you so much. We have a couple questions in the chat here that I'd like to get to, and I hope that there are some questions on the audience as well. So Dr. Peter Martinez is in here from our Northeast campus, and he has several questions in here. And so he was wondering, is there a breakdown about the women, about were they single, were they married, were they from a particular part of the country that were more likely to be accepted? And what about women of color?
Yeah, that's great questions. So the wasp came from all over the continental United States. Literally, like there's an archive at Texas Women's University in Denton, Texas, that's done that has a little graphic on this. And there's no one area of the country that it's like, oh, almost all of them are from this region. It's pretty evenly distributed across the U.S. They are both like all marital statuses, basically. So they're single, married, divorced, etc. There were no qualifiers on this for their service during the war. There was discussion about it because, for example, women who served as nurses in previous U.S. wars were required to be single at certain times. And so they decided not to put any qualifiers on it, partially because there just weren't that many trained pilots, male or female, in the US. And so the idea was that you should take advantage of who you have. And so there actually was a lot of media coverage of the WASP that would talk about like, oh, this woman was a mother of 2 kids and now she's flying planes for the US military and that kind of like footage. Oh, women of color. So all of the branches except for the WASP and the Women Marines admitted segregated units of Black female pilots. The WASP did not, because Jackie Cochran decided literally what she put in her letters to Black female applicants was that she was concerned that the program would be quote unquote controversial. And so she wanted to avoid any type of controversies related to, basically she was trying to hope that like a congressional bill would go before Congress, and she didn't want to alienate congressional reps from certain political backgrounds. And so she decided not to include women, but there were women who later after the war talk about the fact that they were Native American, Hispanic. There were some Japanese American women who served. And so there are women of color who are serving. It's just that Black women in segregated units were not allowed to.
The next question is from here as well, and it said, are there any statues or markers in Sweetwater to honor these women?
Yes, so Sweetwater has the National Wasp Museum. So the museum is there. They have part of the original hangar that they have, kind of redesigned. They also have part of an original sign that was put up when the Wasp first arrived at training, like the sign that they would see as they came in. They also have the original wishing well, which is a tradition that pilots have among each other. So basically, pilots have different traditions after you take your first solo flight in the military where they will do different things to each other. One of them is to throw them in a body of water. And so they would throw women in the wishing well after they had their first solo flight. And so they still have that fountain on campus at near, I forget the name of the campus, but the one that's in Sweetwater. And then there's also a couple markers in the area as well that you can look up like online.
That's absolutely fascinating. My husband is a pilot. He was trained by a World War II pilot. So I need to ask if he did that after his first solo as well.
Yeah.
Any questions in here? Yes.
So when they were recruiting the pilots, female pilots, what qualities did they look for, first of all? And as these pilots became successful, what did they find were the qualities they had that made them successful pilots?
Yeah, so for the first part of your question, when they sent out announcements, they sent this out via newspapers across the country. And what they required was a certain number of flying hours. So basically what they did, the number of flying hours changed throughout the war for both male and female pilots. At various times, they would start out with like 500, then it would drop to like 300, then 250. And then by the end of the war, it's 35. So this is how many flying hours you need in an aircraft, which is typically like a biplane at your local airport that you have experience flying. You needed that many hours of flying prior to the service. So of the 25,000 applicants, a lot of those women did not have the number of hours required. And so that's kind of how their applications get sifted out. Then they were also required to pass a physical because you had to have certain requirements for height, weight, eyesight, etc. And so you had to be like physically ready to fly military aircraft, which took strength during World War II. It's not like automated during the war like it is now. And so people actually, like the WASP themselves, had to go through physical training during the war. But what they required at the beginning was just like passing a basic physical. The women who became successful, a lot of them, like of the people who entered training and then the people that graduated, it's hard to say like with absolute certainty what made someone pass but didn't. But a lot of things that they talked about were just your own ideas of like resilience and also your ability to think on your feet, to think quickly, because often, your instructors would test your abilities, along with like textbook requirements, but then they would also test things like what are you going to do if all of a sudden like this happens, right? And so they would set up all these like scenarios to try to see how well you could think on your feet, and your ability to maintain a like sense of internal calm and focus and ability to think and make quick decisions were the things that they said would make you then like successful pilots.
Thank you. Another question said, was the female Marvel character Wasp named after the wasps?
Yeah, so the Fifinella, is that what we're talking about, I think? So there was a Walt Disney character that was called Fifinella. So basically, there was a British Royal Air Force pilot named Roald Dahl who wrote a lot of children's fiction. If anyone ever read any of his works, he wrote a book called The Gremlins, and one of his characters that then Walt Disney develops into a patch that the wasp wear on their uniform was the Fifinella, and she was a gremlin. And so basically, a lot of pilots have superstitions about flight, and so they would, perform. If anyone's seen Masters of the Air, you'll see this very clearly. But they would perform maybe certain rituals every time before they flew a mission, or they would always carry the same object with them, or they would always like pray the same prayer, or whatever it was, they would do the same thing before like flights that they were nervous about. So gremlins are these like fictionary, imaginary characters that you could blame for aircraft malfunctions or problems. And so people would kind of like roll their eyes and be like, the gremlins are working against us today. So one of the gremlins was a female gremlin named Fifinella. And so that she became like the official wasp mascot. And the wasp kind of adopted her as this idea that like the gremlins are going to be on our side as we're like flying. I hope that answers your question, because I think that's what you're referencing.
I'm not sure, but yeah, I liked it either way. Yes.
I would like to know what questions sort of you still have, or histories you still want to tell, what projects might be coming next for you.
Yeah. So there's a project that I'm not currently working on that if someone listening to this would like to take it on, I will happily give the idea to you, because I don't think I have the time to invest in it right now. But I would love for someone to do a history on the male pilots who served in the continental United States during the war. There's a lot of emphasis on missions overseas and combat, which are great and amazing, but it feels like they're just like not feels like there just aren't those same histories of men who are serving on the home front. And while I was able to interview a couple men who were instructors of the WASP during the war, I found that it was very difficult to even find or connect with those pilots, because they just, even if they served in the military on the home front, they just weren't asked to do interviews. They didn't meet for reunions after the war. It's just very hard to track them down. And so those histories through other sources would be amazing. I personally, right now, so the book that Dr. Northrup mentioned earlier was about trauma and pilots in different regions of the world and different eras. And so my chapter was on American women pilots reintroduction in 1973 through 2001. And so I look at the ways that different branches of the military talked about these women, the ways that the women saw their own service, kind of interpreted military flight, similar themes kind of with the WASP, but also different in terms of love of aviation and drive and resilience and things like that. And then I'm hoping to then take that chapter and turn it into a larger book project. And so that's what I will be working on next. And so I'm interested in, all of the different things that women are going to deal with completely new aircraft technologies, women serving in combat for the first time, all of that kind of thing.
Well, this is absolutely fabulous. I don't know if there's any other questions. So thank you so much. Thank you for bearing with us with some technical issues. I'm sure so many people are going to watch this recording now if you were not able to see it live. So thanks again. I cannot wait to see what you do next. And thank you for sharing the stories of these people who were able to train in Texas and then serve their country. So thanks so much.
Thank you all again so much. Please reach out if you want to.
Thanks.